Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlights series. Today we focus on benchmark CG 4.1. Explain the relationship between U.S. foreign and domestic policy. In Part 2, we focused on the question, how does the United States pursue the national interest? We focus our attention on benchmark clarification 3. Students will define national interests and identify the means available to the national government to pursue the United States national interest. We ask, what is the national interest and how does the United States pursue it? The national interest is what a country believes is necessary to its well-being. Note the photograph or image on the screen. I found this image to be quite interesting because it speaks to various issues relating to the national interest in a way that causes us to think a little bit. Notice how the map of the United States is made up of people. And those people are all very different from one another. And some of the people are standing close to one another, and some of them are either walking towards the image of the United States or walking away from that image of the United States. So what this suggests to us is that this concept of a national interest may have very different perspectives associated with what it actually is. And notice also the information in the lower left corner, U.S. Global Engagement Initiative. In other words, in order for the United States to engage in the world, the United States needs to have a good sense about what its national interest is, even though Americans as a group are quite different from one another, as shown in the crowd, so to speak, of them that is represented in the map. What are the 6 national interests pursued by the United States? One of these is defending the homeland. Certainly the Constitution reflects this perspective in that it is not only stated in the preamble that there needs to be a way to provide for the general welfare and to support the country against all enemies and other threats, using different verbiage from the preamble, but we also see the powers that the Congress and the President have in the Constitution to defend the homeland, such as providing for an army and a navy, to be commander-in-chief, and to declare war, depending on who's holding the power. There is also a focus on deep peace among the Eurasian, that's a combination word of Europe and Asia, Eurasian great powers. So a focus on the great powers of Europe and Asia and promoting a deep peace. A deep peace might be looked at differently from a cold peace, meaning that there's a peace perhaps through a treaty or some other mechanism or means to keep the peace, but it doesn't mean that the countries want to be peaceful towards one another. Rather, they see it as in their best interest. A deep peace means a sincere peace because of common goals and common interests between the countries. Securing access to Persian Gulf oil at a stable, reasonable price. So here we see an emphasis on looking for an energy supplier, and in looking at the energy supplier to make sure that the price is stable and the price is reasonable so that people can have some level of being able to expect what price they might pay, and that the price doesn't change a great deal from day to day. International economic openness. The concept of international economic openness is that the borders are available and open for people to trade and sell goods and services across the borders. Consolidate and spread democracy. Consolidate meaning the idea of bringing many countries together to be democratic countries and to spread democracy so that other countries see the value of democracy and focusing on observing human rights. And then finally, an emphasis of a national interest is no severe climate change, that efforts to protect the climate are in place in order to ensure that there's not significant changes such that there would be intense flooding, intense heat, intense weather. So now we're going to be looking at each of these issues individually. Here we have the symbol of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The symbol of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security we see demonstrates the focus on the United States. We see the eagle, the bald eagle there that is carrying on the left side an olive branch, meaning pursuing peace, but on the right side, in the right talon, we see the arrows, meaning that the country is willing and able and ready to defend itself if needed, but it's also there to extend the olive branch of peace. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security was formed after September 11, 2001, which was the day in U.S. history when there was a major attack on the United States homeland, and several thousand people died as a result of this terrorist attack. What makes it unique is it was the worst terrorist attack on U.S. land in U.S. history. Interest number 2, a deep peace among the Eurasian great powers. So here we see a presentation of different flags of the Eurasian great powers. And notice how different the flags are. And what this also suggests to us is that there's great differences among the people who live in the countries represented by these flags. And because there's so much difference among the people represented by these flags, that it takes good diplomacy to seek a common bond and a deep peace among these various countries. Securing access to Persian Gulf oil at a stable, reasonable price. Notice here, this is a book cover, but notice the title of the book cover. It's kind of a play on words, as well as the book cover including a map of the Persian Gulf area of the world. So crude is a word for rough, unfinished, unpolished. But oil, when it's taken out of the ground, is called crude oil because it hasn't been processed yet. So this idea of a crude strategy is really kind of interesting, because a crude strategy is one that's highly imperfect, but at the same time there has to be a plan in order to secure access to Persian Gulf oil at a stable, reasonable price. So there's a crude strategy according to this author, and you can see some evidence of that strategy in the map, where you've got planes and boats and military individuals who are defending and acting in the best interest of pursuing this stable, reasonable price through a crude strategy. What about number 4, international economic openness? This graphic is provided by the International Monetary Fund. You see in the lower right corner, IMF. And so on the left side, in the blue bar graph, we see the global flows of goods, services, and finance. And we see from 1980 up to 2020, there was a significant increase in the global flows. So this suggests economic openness. Now, 2020 was also the year that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, started. And so consequently, it would be interesting to see how this graph unfolds after 2020. Then we look at the right side about trade restrictions. Notice that between 2009 and 2021, that there has been an increase in the imposition of trade restrictions, both whether it relates to goods, investment, or services. And in many respects, this suggests to us that there is economic openness through trade restrictions. In other words, that countries are doing more to make sure that their goods and services are available, but they're also making sure that they meet certain standards, that they, when they do trade or the country buys certain things, that both sides see this is in their best interest, that people are treated well, and these restrictions make certain that different countries are treated well when people are buying goods and services. One of the things that we certainly don't want is for us in the United States to be buying goods and services from overseas and then having them not be produced in a manner that demonstrates quality control. So therefore, there is restrictions on who can sell to the United States in order to ensure quality control. What about consolidating and spreading democracy and observing human rights? So here we have a public opinion poll from the Pew Research Center collected in 2019. And this is focusing on the percent of people who say it is very important to have something, a certain something in their country. And this is a global attitude survey, and those different somethings are a fair judiciary, 82%. It was the highest response in terms of very important. Gender equality, 74%, very important in their country. Free religion, regular elections, free speech, press freedom, etc. So all of these different democratic principles, we see that in this global study of 34 countries, that at least 50% and somewhere between 54 and 82% said that it was very important to have that democratic principle in place in their country. And finally, we look at a goal of no severe climate change. Look at these different images from NASA, the National Aeronautical and Space Administration. Right here we see a wildfire on the left, and wildfires are often caused by a spark when there's not enough rain, and then because of especially in a forest, you have a dried bed of grass and leaves and twigs and sticks, and they very easily catch fire, and the trees themselves do not have enough moisture, and the ground is dry, etc. It leads to massive wildfires that really could potentially threaten homes that are both near and far, and of course it also affects the quality of the air. We see the dried and cracked ground. Does this ground look like you could plant crops in it, that you could plant things in it? Of course not. And then we also see evidence of severe weather near our native Florida, focusing on the image on the right side. And it is in the U.S. national interest to avoid severe climate change. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. Do you still have questions? If so, please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.